So now what? You've set up your lights, you set up your surfaces. How do you get it out of here? Well, very simply, with the camera selector, we're going to select properties. And Lightwave 11 makes this even easier than any version before because we've got everything consolidated into one panel. Used to have to go to multiple panels and it was kind of a pain in the butt. So what we're working with is just one camera. Now, I should mention you can have multiple cameras. If you go to the Items tab, you can add other cameras. Why would you do that? Well, let's say, for instance, in this course, I was jumping around between different views and moving the camera around to see different things. You can have cameras fixed in different positions and then render out each one of those and edit them together later. You can do architectural animation where one camera is stationary, one camera is moving. If you have accident recreation, you can have a camera inside a car and one that's standing as a bystander on the side of a street and things like that. And you can render each one of those views of your 3D scene and cut it together. For most everything we've done, we've used just one camera. Now we have a perspective camera, and that's been our main camera. There are other things like the advanced camera, which we didn't talk about in the course, but simply you can actually take this camera and you can make an object a camera. You can change its position and get really in depth, so I encourage you to get into the Lightwave manual to look more into this. This came out a number of years ago, and to be honest, I actually haven't found much of a need for it in terms of my work, but maybe you will. There's also the classic camera, and this changes the anti-aliasing system back a little bit. There's certain things that will render and not render in these views as well. You get an orthogonal camera, which is really cool for doing things to flatten out so we don't get that heavy 3D perspective and you get a very sort of designer look. Not designer as in graphic designer, but somebody who's working with SolidWorks or AutoCAD, things like that. Okay, perspective camera, that's one we've been using. And you can have a real lens camera, but I'm going to be perfectly honest, it doesn't really match a real lens. Doesn't match my lenses anyway. So if you wanted to, you can punch in a zoom factor or focal length, and you could choose, let's say, I'll choose my Nikon, and I will choose my D3 that's not in here. This is not very current. And then I would choose maybe my 24-72-8, something like that. And the idea behind this is that you can render out an animation and then match a photograph, match an image better because that aspect ratio is in there, but that doesn't work for me. Okay, shift camera. This is actually really cool. What you do with the shift camera, like a tilt shift lens, you can actually have different focal planes and create basically a miniature look. So if you have more of a landscape or you've got a larger scene, try putting this on and very simply putting a focal plane on and rendering that out and seeing how that looks for you. It's really simple to set up. And a surface baking camera. And what this will do is bake your surface into your object, and that gets into some more advanced things, which we're not covering in this course. Could be doing it down the road. Surface baking will actually let you bake in, such as meaning record, into a file, shadows, light, radiosity, all those things that are heavy calculations, you can bake them in so that you can reload your scene and look at it as if it's shaded, but it'll play back in real time. A good example of surface baking is something like video games. Often those aren't as rendered on the fly like we're seeing here for our logo. A lot of those shadows and those textures are all baked in or frozen or almost painted into the surface. They're not being calculated with each frame. So lastly, let's go back here to a perspective camera. We've got our focal length that we set earlier, just kind of giving us this wide angle look. We're looking through the camera view. You can see our zoom factor and our field of view right there. The resolution we set up a long time ago earlier in the course, that everything we did was 1920 by 1080 for HD. The resolution multiplier, which is really neat, is that let's say you just want to render out this thing a little bit faster. I can jump this down to 25%. Press F9, and we'll get a little bit quicker render because we're only rendering a quarter of the image. But we're keeping all of our same aspect ratio and everything else. So now you can see how fast that came out. Just to give us a little quick preview. And what's good about that is that I don't have anti-aliasing on, and that's really going to jack up our render. So minimum and maximum samples. I want my minimum to always be about 9 for my stuff, and maybe 18 for the max. So it's never going to be too little, but never too much. In olden times, we used to use a value of 9 with the enhanced medium anti-aliasing. And what anti-aliasing does is it goes over and click back in here and press F9. it goes over and just a smoothing. It's almost a blurring in a way. And sometimes there's a subpixel render that repositions the pixels, but ideally anti-aliasing is a blurring, and it gives your edges a much smoother appearance. So in our little frame here, you can see we've got all these kind of chunky little looks right here in the front surface of this logo. That's because there's no anti-aliasing on. You can see little choppy edges right here. So you need this filter on when you do your final renders. It's very, very important. Now you notice though, as soon as I did that, even at 25% resolution, my render times go up significantly. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast, and you just have to go with it because, well, it's great to do this as a preview, but never judge anything till you see a quality render from your finals, from your final setup. It's very, very important. We'll just wait for this to come out. Yeah, see, frame elapsed time, 13 minutes. I don't think it was really 13 minutes, but that's what time is remaining, it says. And the reason it's saying that is because even though it looks like it's fully rendered, we've got minimum of 9 and max of 18. So it's going to actually make some passes on here. You can see the anti-aliasing value right there. Now the reconstruction filter is set to classic. I mean, it's kind of old school, but it actually works just fine, and I find myself using that quite often. The sampling pattern is set to low so that it's not resampling and recalculating every single time, and gives us a little more speed. You're going to find that you might need to change that if you're doing things like interiors, like architectural design, something with more radiosity. But for a simple logo like this, minimum and maximum 918 is probably overkill. But you can see here that once it got that first pass done, this 9 passes it's doing on this back end are actually working just fine. And again, these are still really inexpensive renders. You can do them over lunchtime and come back and still have a very nice frame. All right, so there it is. Now you can see that's much, much cleaner. And in this render view that pops up, by the way, there's a layer button. And if I left it open, which I did, it will leave your frames in the buffer. If you close this, it'll cancel them out. So if you want to see a history of your renders, leave this open. So there it is without anti-aliasing. You can see all the chunkiness and fuzz in there. And the reason this is going to be bad is because when it's moving, you're really going to notice it. And then here it is with the anti-aliasing, and it smooths out all those edges. So keep that on, and every scene is going to be a little bit different, so you might need to change those values a little bit. I never use soft filter, but soft filter kind of blurs your whole scene. And the threshold, if we make this lower, it's a tighter calculation. I always leave this at default. For motion blur, we're going to put this on. We'll put a little photoreal motion blur on. Why not? And that's perfect logo to do it, because when it flies right through here, it'll have a little motion blur going, which is great. And you can put a blur length on, 50 to 60% is usually about what I use. But depending on what you're setting up, you might want to put a little bit more on. The more passes you have, the more accurate it is, but the more render time it takes. And that is really setting up the camera. To render this out, there's the Output tab. It's all within this Render Globals. And to get to this panel, you hit Render in the tab right at the top of the screen, and on the left is Render Globals. Now, most of you will probably want to just save out an animation, and there's QuickTime because I'm on a Mac. If you're on a PC, you'll see Windows Media. And you can do a sprite generation, a storyboard, and what a storyboard will do, if you click the options, you can render out a version of your animation in a storyboard-like format. You can do a QuickTime Stereo. I never really use any of these, to be honest. You can do Film Expand, but yeah, for the rest of us, we're using QuickTime Save Animation. Now, once I click Animation File, give it a place to save. You know what? I rarely do that unless it's just a preview, and here's why. The QuickTime and Windows, both Mac and PC, this little plugin, that can crash. And it's not so much a Lightwave thing as it is just a component thing. I've had them on both systems in our studio. These crash. And guess what? You just left for the evening or you left for the weekend hoping this thing renders. So turn that off. Do that for a preview over lunch. The safer way, oh, and let me go back. The other problem with doing this is that when you click the options, that you may set the wrong compression or the wrong size. There's too many variables here that can go wrong and waste your render time. So I do save RGB instead. Call it up, give it a place to save. I usually have a separate drive for that. Then the type of image. If it has no background, you can do a 32-bit PNG. So our black background will actually disappear. But because I want this black blended in with the blue, this is our background now. We wouldn't do a PNG 32, we do a 24. You can also choose TIFFs, but sometimes they get a little bit large. Certain programs don't like them. Everything seems to like PNGs, and they're not super huge, but the quality's good. And what this will do, will save out a sequence. It'll say Lightwave version 3, and I can rename this, of course, 001, 002, 003, and so on. And what I do then is I load up QuickTime Pro, which I don't have on this system, and I say File, and I go Import Sequence. That image sequence is imported, and I export it out at any format I need. But I'm rendering at full quality, full resolution with this. No compression, and well, a little bit with the PNG, but we're not wasting time with our QuickTime hoping that it saves. We know it's going to save. And the advantage also of doing RGB frames is that if your client needs an image, you can pull one from there. You don't have to re-render. And if you ever have to reload it and save it, you can. And if you decide that you want to crash your system, turn it off, whatever, you haven't lost all that time rendering. When you're rendering out a QuickTime or an AVI, often if that crashes, you lose what you saved because a file is not completed. With sequences, well, if it stops rendering, at least you've saved what you've already rendered. This is the format for the file names right down here. None of it really matters other than your preference. The thing that does matter, I should say, is if you have more than 999 frames, you might want to put 4 digits in there. Color space. Now this is something new that was in Lightwave 10. Carried it over through 11. We always use sRGB to go to print at the studio, but we always do everything with RAW or Pro Photo color. But most of the time, linear has been working fine, but you can change your color space on your output, and that has to do with what the file will be going to, and if somebody's editing and needs it in a certain match. You can pre-multiply or unpre-multiply the alpha channels if you're using an alpha channel, and then of course that alpha channel has a color space as well. Once that's on, I always save the scene. That value is set with the scene, and then you hit under options. There's render globals, right? Render scene. Once you hit that, it says you want to turn off render display. You would say yes, and away we go. And it's rendering frame by frame. So you set up your camera resolution, anti-aliasing, go to output, tell it where to save. Make sure the check mark's on to save, even if you're doing QuickTime. You can do both at the same time and save it out. Once you do this, again, make sure you save the scene, because here's what you can do. Let's say you did have multiple cameras. Open up the render queue, one of my favorite things in Lightwave. The render queue lets me add multiple scenes. So as long as you save your scene with information about where it's going to save its render queue will work for you. And of course, make sure your scene will load the proper objects and images, that nothing is missing. And what you can do in here is just add up all of your scenes one after the other and hit render, and it will pop up a scene, it'll render it, it'll save it to wherever the scene data has it set, right there, whatever you told it to. And as soon as it's done, it will render the next scene and the next. So I've actually set up animations and had my computer render 6 different animations over the course of an entire weekend. And I came in and they were all done. And it was just really terrific. So render queue is your friend when you've got multiple scenes. And that is it. Let's move on to the last video and we'll close it out.